Cassandra Welsh sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the neat lines of her perfect world. The pristine white walls, marble countertops, and gleaming appliances all seemed to embody the stability she had once dreamed of in her youth. But now this perfect world felt more like a cage. Sunlight streamed through the windows, playing on the surface of her gold bracelet, the only piece of jewelry she wore daily. She twirled it with her fingers, thinking about how this symbol of love and security had become a reminder that life could be both reliable and suffocating. Her husband, Thomas, entered the kitchen in his usual gray suit. He was punctual to a fault. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he drank his coffee and read the newspaper, leaving it halfway through to finish later in the evening. His movements were methodical, just like his daily routine. "Good morning, Cass," he said, not looking up from his phone, where notifications from the office were coming in. She replied with her usual smile, but inside she felt a pang of irritation. He always called her Cass, as if it were easier to say than her full name. In the early years of their marriage, it had seemed endearing. Now it felt mechanical. "Good morning, Tom. The coffee's ready." He nodded, took his cup, and sat down at the table. Cassandra watched as he read the news, his face focused, as if the world depended on it. She knew every wrinkle on his forehead, every gesture of his, as if he were an old book she had read dozens of times. Thomas was a good man, of that she had no doubt. Stable, hardworking, devoted. But behind these qualities lay a wall she couldn't break through. "How was your night?" he asked, still not looking up. "Fine," she replied. But the night had been far from normal. She had lain awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and wondering where the feelings that once filled her had gone. When Thomas left for work, leaving behind the scent of his cologne and the familiar sound of the closing door, Cassandra felt the silence of the house envelop her. It wasn't even 9 in the morning, and already she felt like she had nothing to do. She had cleaned the house to a shine the day before. Lunch was planned for the week ahead. The book she had been trying to read lay on the coffee table in the living room, but her attention slid over the words without sticking. She opened the window, letting in the spring air, and heard the sounds of life beyond her small world. Children laughed, playing outside. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine rumbled loudly. It was a foreign world, dynamic and chaotic, one she observed but couldn't touch. She remembered how, in her youth, she had imagined her life: travel, art, late-night conversations with a loved one. But now those dreams seemed like something from the past, distant and unattainable. After her morning coffee, she decided to go for a run. In recent months, exercise had become her escape from monotony. Her choice was a small park a couple of blocks from home. It was always quiet there, the trees providing a cozy shade, and the alleys were secluded enough for her to think. Today, as she ran past children kicking a ball and an elderly couple walking their dog, she felt a strange unease. Her steps slowed, and she stopped at a small bench. She sat down looking at the pond, whose smooth surface reflected the blue sky. "This is how life passes," she muttered to herself, feeling a tightness in her chest. "Time moves on, and I'm stuck." Her thoughts were interrupted when a stranger sat down next to her on the bench. He was young, about 5 years her junior, with a light stubble and a confident smile. He looked at her, then at the pond, as if choosing what to say. "Nice spot for reflection, isn't it?" His voice was low, calm. Cassandra looked up, slightly surprised. "Yes, it's one of my favorites." "Sorry to intrude," he added. "It's just nice to know someone else finds this place special too." Cassandra smiled, feeling some of the tension ease. "Do you come here often?" she asked. "Quite often, mainly in the mornings. The park helps clear my thoughts before the workday." He extended his hand. "I'm Daniel." "Cassandra," she replied, feeling her voice soften more than usual. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was something in that look that made her feel a bit more alive. Daniel smiled again, but didn't impose. He stood up from the bench and gave a short nod. "Have a good day, Cassandra." "You too," she replied, watching him go. When he left, she remained seated, feeling a slight excitement. It was a strange feeling. She knew there was nothing special about that look, just a random conversation with a stranger in the park. But the feeling of something new, something fresh, made her heart beat faster. And for the first time in a long time, as she walked home, she felt a little lighter. The warmth of the spring sun was slowly fading as Cassandra found herself back in the kitchen that evening. Thomas sat in his usual spot, methodically flipping through the pages of the newspaper. His face was tense, but there was nothing new about it. It was his usual seriousness, a reflection of a man completely focused on his work. Cassandra set the table. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, everything looked perfect, as it did every evening. "Thanks," Thomas muttered, barely glancing at the food. He quickly immersed himself in his reading, leaving her alone, even while sitting next to her. Cassandra looked at him. His face, once so familiar, now seemed foreign. She tried to remember the last time they had really talked. Not about work, not about bills, but about something that mattered. The question stuck in her throat. She turned away to keep from crying. After dinner, Thomas retreated to his study. His absence at the table always left a certain emptiness. She took a cup of coffee, returned to the kitchen, and sat by the window looking out. The sound of neighboring children's laughter and the glow of headlights on the asphalt made that world seem so distant. She thought of Daniel, his confidence, his ease in conversation. That brief encounter had sparked something in her that she had long lost. She found herself wanting to feel that spark again. The next morning, Cassandra returned to the park. Her feet led her to the same bench where they had met. She sat down expecting something, though she couldn't explain what. Her thoughts were focused on escaping the monotony. After a while, she heard his voice. "Good morning, Cassandra." She looked up and saw Daniel. He stood before her with the same easy smile. "Good morning," she replied, feeling her heart beat faster. They talked again. This time the conversation lasted longer. She learned that he worked in real estate, that he loved running in the mornings to clear his head. He was an attentive listener, and Cassandra found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone. As they said goodbye, he looked at her with a slight interest. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime," he suggested. Cassandra paused. The question seemed innocent, but there was a danger lurking beneath it. She could refuse, blame busyness or something else. But instead, she nodded. That would be nice. Walking home, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. What was she doing? Why did this stranger attract her so much? She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but she couldn't stop herself. At home, Thomas was the same. His calmness contrasted with the storm of emotions raging within her. She looked at him and couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in her life, but in her. The day began like many others. Thomas left the house at exactly 8:30, leaving behind a neat silence. Cassandra sat on the couch with a cup of tea, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered Daniel's words, his soft, reassuring tone, and that look that made her feel special. At noon, she decided to go out. This time, she wasn't going to the park to accidentally meet Daniel. She headed downtown where they had agreed to have coffee. It was a simple proposal without any subtext, but it still felt like a step across a line. When she entered the cafe, her heart skipped a beat. Daniel was already there, sitting by the window. He looked relaxed, his confidence seemingly filling the room. "Hi, Cassandra," he said, standing up to greet her. His smile was wide, genuine. "Hi, Daniel," she replied, sitting down across from him. She tried to appear calm, but her hands trembled slightly. They talked about trivial things, work, news, but underneath the conversation there was a tension. Cassandra couldn't help but feel that this meeting was more than just a chat. When their eyes met, Daniel took her hand. "Have you thought about what I said last time?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Cassandra looked away, her thoughts jumbled. She knew he was talking about happiness, about how she deserved more than she had now. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. "I don't know, Daniel," she said softly. "It's so complicated. I have Thomas. I have commitments. I can't just destroy everything." He squeezed her hand, his gaze full of understanding. "I'm not asking you to destroy anything, Cassandra. But don't you want to live? Don't you deserve to feel alive?" His words hit her deeper than she expected. They drank their coffee in silence, each lost in their thoughts. When it was time to say goodbye, Daniel looked at her again. "I just want you to be happy. Think about it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Returning home, Cassandra found Thomas sitting in the living room. His face was thoughtful, his gaze distant. She sat across from him, feeling the tension rise. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to hide her nervousness. Thomas looked up, his gaze penetrating. "Cass, I don't know what's going on, but I feel like you're drifting away. You haven't been yourself for a while. Is something wrong?" Thomas's words hit her like lightning. She hadn't expected him to notice. But now that he had said it, she couldn't deny it. She tried to find the words to explain, but nothing came to mind. I'm just tired," she finally said. "It's nothing. I'm probably just overworked." Thomas nodded, but his eyes didn't leave her. "If there's something you want to talk about, I'm here," he said softly. His voice was full of sincerity, and it only intensified her guilt. Cassandra went to the bedroom, leaving him in the living room. Lying in bed, she tried to sort out her feelings. Her rift with Thomas had grown even wider. She knew she had to make a choice, but she couldn't bring herself to make a decision. The silence of the night weighed on her, and she realized that her life would never be the same. Morning came heavily. Cassandra woke up before the alarm, staring at the bedroom ceiling, which seemed more like a barrier between the past and the future. Thomas was still sleeping beside her, his face peaceful, as if he didn't know the chaos raging in her soul. Her heart ached at the thought of having to continue this double life. In the kitchen, she prepared breakfast, but her hands trembled. She knew something had to change. When Thomas entered the kitchen, she met his gaze and smiled, but inside everything was churning. "Good morning," he said, reaching for his coffee cup. "Morning," she replied, trying to appear calm. They exchanged a few meaningless phrases before Thomas left for work. Cassandra watched as the door closed behind him and felt a void that became more tangible with each passing day. She spent the morning in anticipation of meeting Daniel. This time they had agreed to meet in a small park, hidden from prying eyes. As she approached the meeting spot, her heart was pounding so hard she thought passers-by could hear it. Daniel was already waiting for her. He smiled when he saw her and gestured for her to sit next to him on the bench. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice soft and warm. "Me too," she replied, trying not to show her excitement. They talked about many things. Work, how their days had gone, but Cassandra knew they were both avoiding the main topic. The silence that fell was almost deafening. Finally, Daniel broke it. "Cassandra, I can't do this anymore. I want to be with you, but I don't want to be the one who destroys your life. You have to decide what you want." Her eyes filled with tears. She knew he was right. She had been dragging this situation out for too long, clinging to Thomas, to their shared home, to everything that seemed safe. But Daniel was the one who made her feel alive. I don't know," she whispered. "I'm scared. Scared of losing everything I have, but also scared of staying where I'm no longer happy." Daniel took her hand, his touch firm and reassuring. "I understand. I'm not rushing you, but you have to be honest with yourself, Cassandra. Only then will you find what you truly need." They sat in silence, enjoying the warmth of the spring sun. At that moment, Cassandra realized that her life would never be the same. She had to make a choice that would define her future. When she returned home, Thomas was already there. His face looked tense, and he sat at the table with a cup of coffee. Cassandra felt her heart sink. "You're late," he said, not looking up. "Yes," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I had some things to do." He nodded, but the silence between them was almost unbearable. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Cassandra, I can't ignore this anymore. You're drifting away. I see it. What's going on?" His words were like a knife, piercing her heart. She knew she couldn't lie anymore. "Thomas," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you. About us. About what I'm feeling." His face remained calm, but his eyes were filled with concern. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low and firm. Cassandra took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She knew these words would change everything they had built together. "I feel like we've lost our connection. Something between us has changed, and I'm not sure I can keep pretending everything is okay." Thomas looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. "Is this because of someone else?" he finally asked. Her breath caught. She knew this moment would come, but it didn't make it any less painful. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not just about that. It's about us, about how we become strangers to each other. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Thomas stood up, his face pale but resolute. I need time to process all of this, he said. I don't know what will happen next, Cassandra, but I appreciate your honesty. He left the room, leaving her alone. Cassandra sat at the table, feeling her world crumble around her. But deep down, she knew this was the first step toward honesty, with herself and with Thomas. Her future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it, whatever it might be. Several weeks had passed since Cassandra had opened up to Thomas. Their home, once filled with predictable comfort, now felt like a battlefield. The silence was no longer peaceful, and the atmosphere was tense. Thomas avoided conversations, left for work earlier, and returned later. Cassandra felt the space between them growing wider, and this distance caused her pain, despite her decision. She spent her days reflecting on what her future would look like. Daniel didn't pressure her, but his presence, his support, were her anchor during this tumultuous period. He was patient, giving her time to sort herself out, but she knew he was waiting, and she was waiting too, for the clarity she so desperately needed. One evening, returning home, Cassandra found Thomas sitting in the living room. His face was weary, his gaze distant. She sat across from him, feeling the tension rise. We need to talk, he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Cassandra sat down, her heart racing. She didn't know what to expect, but she was ready. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, his voice low but firm. About us, about how we ended up here. And honestly, I think we've lost what made us a couple. I don't want to blame you. I'm at fault too. We both allowed this to happen. Cassandra nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I feel that too, Thomas. I've been trying to understand where we went wrong, but I think we both need to start over. Maybe apart. Thomas looked at her intently. His face was calm, but the sadness he hid was evident. I agree, he said finally. It won't be easy, but maybe it's the best for both of us. The conversation ended more easily than she had expected. Instead of a fight and mutual accusations, there was a quiet agreement, filled with respect and the pain of loss. They agreed to separate amicably, to give each other the freedom they both so desperately needed. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but it was inevitable. Several months had passed. Cassandra had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her new life began modestly, but she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. In her apartment stood a small easel, and in the evenings, she picked up her brushes again. The colors on the canvas reflected her state, warm, bright hues symbolizing hope and new energy. Daniel remained by her side. He was the one who helped her through the toughest moments. Their relationship developed slowly, cautiously, but there was something real about it, something she was afraid to name but knew. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One evening, they sat in the park where it all began. Cassandra looked at the pond, which reflected the setting sun, and Daniel held her hand. The silence between them was comfortable. Are you happy? He asked, his voice soft but genuine. She paused. Happiness had always seemed unattainable to her, but at this moment, she understood that it wasn't. I think I am, she replied, turning to him. It's not perfect, but I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. Daniel smiled and leaned in to kiss her. This kiss was different from before. It was a kiss of confidence, trust, and the future. As they stood up to leave, Cassandra looked back at the park. She knew there were many challenges ahead, but she also knew she was stronger than she had been before. She had made a choice that changed her life, and now she was ready to move forward. Under the setting sun, hand in hand, they walked into a new day, leaving the past behind.